Greetings to all and welcome to the UNESCO Chair in Language Policies for Multilingualism, with headquarters at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Florianópolis, Brazil. In our discussion today, our main question will be, what is multilingualism and what are the main concepts and discussions associated with it? What is its relevance for societies and for the people? So, multilingualism will be our central concept in this unit. And it's exactly the need to manage the many languages and their use in human societies that led to the development of the concepts of language policy and language planning that will be our second most important concepts. Let's start by defining multilingualism and language policy, presenting some other associated concepts and some of the main discussions in the field. Obviously, the word multilingualism has a certain degree of transparency in common parlance. It means the presence and use of several languages in the same space, which can be a family home, an institution, or a company, or a country. Also, the word bilingualism associated with it has a wide circulation, characterizing in common sense a person or community that uses two languages in its communication. Thus, it is common to speak about bilingual schools, schools that use two languages in the educational process, according to several ways to regulate the use of each one in the total time of work. Multilingualism is a much more common phenomenon than monolingualism. Also, 20th century linguistics, following the trail of 19th century Romantic linguistics, was developed on the idea of monolingualism and linguistic identity, presupposing a monolingual speaker and a perfect native speaker. Monolingualism as a discipline is, of course, an interdisciplinary phenomenon involving neurolinguistics, psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, language policy, but also sociology, anthropology, economics, and even engineering. In this course, we will deal with the phenomenon specifically from the point of view of language policy. To see multilingualism from the point of view of language policy is to say that we observe the decisions made on languages and their circulation, as well as concrete measures to ensure the presence of and use of specific languages, or their absence in an institution or territory, the way in which societies try to organize, by habits or by an explicit legal order, the conflicts that emerge between the various linguistic communities. This will allow us to observe the growth of certain linguistic communities and the retraction of others, or the attempts by linguistic communities to value their respective languages, preparing them to fulfill new functions in society. We should not forget, therefore, that language policy, in the definition of Louis-Jean Calvi, are decisions that are made about languages, their denomination, structure, circulation, diffusion. Language planning, on the other hand, is the implementation of language policies, that is, concrete actions on languages, guided by previous decisions taken from linguistic ideologies that connect languages politically with other fields where decisions are also being taken and implemented. Thus, for example, the Portuguese Prime Minister Marquis de Pombal decided in 1757, through a document called the Directory of the Indians, to replace the language of Portuguese colonization and mission in the multilingual Brazilian Amazon, Nhangatu, through the Portuguese language. He implemented this policy through a system of schools and was based on an ideology of governance. Subjects should speak the language of the king who conquered them, because they will develop affection for this king. Here, we see clearly the police, the planning, and the ideology that moved the agent to the decision-making. But the discussion of the main concepts of language policy and planning will be subject of a second unit of our discussion. Let's go back to multilingualism. Let's see two definitions of multilingualism. Lee, 2008, defined a multilingual individual as anyone who can communicate in more than one language, be it active through speaking and writing, or passive through listening and reading. The European Commission, on the other hand, in 2007, defined multilingualism as the ability of societies, institutions, groups, and individuals to engage on a regular basis, reach more than one language in their day-to-day lives. These definitions of multilingualism are relevant for discussing some of its dimensions: the individual versus social dimension, the proficiency versus use dimension, and the bilingualism versus the multilingualism dimension. Let's take first bilingualism versus multilingualism. We have three possibilities for the research in these areas. The first one takes bilingualism as the generic term. This is the traditional position that reflects the importance of research involving two languages rather than additional languages. Bilingualism here generally refers to two languages but can include more languages. A second position sees bilingualism and multilingualism as different terms. Some researchers use the term bilingual for users of two languages and multilingual for three or more. This position is also common among scholars working on third language acquisition and trilingualism. And the last one has multilingualism as the generic term. This can be regarded as the mainstream position nowadays. Multilingualism is often used to refer to two or more languages. Bilingualism or trilingualism are instances of multilingualism. These two definitions given by Lee and by the European Commission also allow us to see the individual and collective dimensions of multilingualism. Multilingualism is at the same time an individual and a social phenomenon. It can be considered as an ability of an individual, or it can refer to the use of languages in society. Individual and societal multilingualism are not completed separated. It is more likely that the individuals who live in multilingual community speak more than one language than for individuals who live in a monolingual society. Another dimension to be considered is the one that opposes a view that multilingualism lives in the use of languages versus another that is concerned with the proficiency that individuals reveal when speaking the two or more languages of their repertoire. The concern with language proficiency is still an inheritance of the idea that it's necessary to speak the language close to the native speaker to be considered bilingual. This idea comes from the model of the ideal monolingual native speaker, while the other view, based on usage, is more realistically anchored in real situations, attentive to the many ways of participating in different linguistic communities, which sometimes occurs only passively. How could we expect, for example, that in the concrete interactions in multilingual environments, the speakers would have or should have a proficiency close to the native speaker? In his studies of the multilingual or plurilingual markets of African countries, such as in Brazzaville, Republic of Congo, Calvi and other linguists show the constant use of several languages depending on the location of the market in the city, the type of goods sold, and languages handled by buyers, so that the actual use in interactions is a priority over the concern with a given proficiency, to the point of the author asserts that in many contexts, syntax is a luxury, since an important part of communication is based only on the lexicon. Code switching with the constant use of more than one language at the same time in alternation, or the use of pidgins such as Pichi in Equatorial Guinea, or interlanguages such as Portuñol in South America or Spanglish in North America, are different crystallization or strategies of these multilingual uses. In other contexts of multilingualism, however, there is a major effort to establish proficiency criteria and to qualify the speaker's proficiency, as in the case of the European Union and its Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. The Common European Framework of Reference is an international agreement which organizes linguistic relations between EU member states, established common levels of proficiency and measurement strategies for the official languages of the Union, and regulates internal mobility in the world of education and work. That is, therefore, a multilingualism organized as a state project, made with the legal mechanisms that are specific to the states, and not, as in the case of the aforementioned markets, based on the free coexistence or interacting linguistic communities in private seller-buyer relations. Apart from this more official functioning of EU state policies, of course, we will also find in Europe freer use of multilingualism, involving both the official European languages and the many other languages spoken on the continent which are not in the common frame of reference, such as Arabic in Marseille, Turkish in Berlin, or Berber in Barcelona, for example. Let us turn to some preliminary data before entering new discussions. It's important to say that there are in the world between 6,900 and 7,100 languages, and that for the sake of simplification, we are going to take the number of 7,000 as a parameter. Naturally, it's very difficult to count languages, since languages are defined by their association with cultural and political identities, which are changing and in many cases are controversial. As we cannot speak of languages outside power relations, what we count as languages are hegemonic interpretations which assert the existence of some and deny the existence of other languages. One of the most important characteristics of this universe of languages spoken in the world is the inequality that exists among languages and among linguistic communities. Of the 7,000 languages of the world, only 195 are official to some extent in a country or region, while 2,680 minor languages with fewer speakers are at risk of extinction according to the UNESCO Atlas of Languages in Danger. Although some 4,000 languages today have some kind of writing system, no more than 700 have a written tradition. That is, they are used effectively in a multiplicity of written textual genres with a specific circulation and use, and they have permanent writers and readers. Of the 7,000 languages, only 236 are well represented and used on the internet, according to Pimienta and Prado, 2016. An environment so important for the circulation and knowledge, circulation of knowledge and the future of languages. Most languages are not used in any health or educational system, so millions of people have to study or be seen in hospitals in languages they do not speak. Until a few years ago, the sign languages were not recognized as languages and were thus excluded even from statistics on the languages of the world. It is a proof of how ideological our definitions of language can be and that changes in these ideologies and definitions can suddenly greatly alter the object we call language. Sign languages are languages that use the visual manual modality to convey meaning. Language is expressed via the manual sign stream in combination with non-manual elements. Sign languages are full-fledged natural languages with their own grammar and lexicon. There are at least 200 sign languages in the world from various origins and language families, but this number can reach up to 300 different languages. When we see this great inequality between the language communities, not only in terms of the number of speakers, but especially in terms of language equipment with different technologies, we see what speakers can actually do with them, what political spaces they can occupy with their languages. We enter the delicate field of linguistic rights. To what extent do language communities have the right to use their languages in different contexts, for example? But we also enter the delicate field of linguistic economy and economics. To what extent is language a resource for the language community, or is multilingualism a resource for a country made up of several linguistic communities? Given that law and economy are politically organized fields and therefore affected by disputes between individuals and between collectivities, we can quickly verify that these language communities are organized in power relations, and that the language of some may be a problem for others. For this reason, the German sociolinguist Peter Nelde formulated his Nelde's Law, 1987, and said that there is no linguistic contact without linguistic conflict. How can we observe multilingualism and the relations among languages and languages communities? One possible approach is to observe multilingualism from these inequalities. Let us look at three possibilities. In the first one, we will see the Calvi barometer of languages, established from a theory of language weight, une théorie du poids des langues, especially useful for the big or most spoken languages. In the second, on the contrary, we'll briefly see the UNESCO World Atlas of Languages in Danger, which analyzes exactly the opposite group, that is, of the small languages in danger of extinction. In the third, we will observe maps generated from the US census, which shows the disposition of speakers of languages and consequently of languages in the territory. Of course, the first difficulty will be to determine which language we are talking about. It's difficult to consider that names of languages are reflecting reality, a problem that we will address better later. There are 27 variants of Nahuatl as well as of Malay, 11 of Malagasy, 3 of Tonga, which have no relation to each other, 3 of Yaka, and many other contentious cases have been indexed. The list is too long for it to be reasonable to give it exhaustively, as said Louis-Jean Calvi. This situation creates a problem because many data concerning languages do not specify which variant it includes. For example, continues Calvi, the typical case is Arabic. There is a so-called Standard Arabic and 34 so-called dialectal Arabic, which are in fact the mother tongue of all or almost all Arabic speakers. If, for example, we search for the presence of Arabic in Wikipedia, we find more than 500,000 pages in Arabic without further specification, and 17,000 in Egyptian Arabic. In this case, we use a language name politically to cover a field of possible multiply languages that do not understand each other as separate entities, or that simply accept a common standard, as in the case of both Arabic and Chinese, for example. Observing multilingualism, therefore, depends on the construction of theoretically motivated observation apparatuses that allow to circumscribe the many contradictions that emerge from those complexities in the world of languages. Although aware of these difficulties, Calvi formulated a theory of the weight of languages as an attempt to observe these inequalities, these differences. He and his brother created the Calvi barometer of languages and used 12 criteria to measure the weight of languages and see how a language can accumulate geopolitical power. Although he had fixed from a number of sources a corpus of 6,141 languages in the world, without regard to sign languages, for example, he then applied the system to a corpus of 634 languages, most of which the most heavily weighted languages in the planet. He divided the factors that attribute weight to languages into two groups. The first one he calls the factors intrinsic to the language, like 1, the number of speakers, 2, entropy, 3, the vehicular factor, 4, the status of language, it means official language, 5, the number of translations from the language, 6, the number of translations into the language, 7, international literary awards, 8, activity in Wikipedia, 9, education at the university level. And then 3 factors more that he calls the contextual factors. 10, the Human Development Index. 11, Fertility Index. 12, Internet network penetration. Let's look a little more closely at each one. Number 1, the number of speakers. The number of speakers reveals much about the power of a language, generally associated with a powerful state, which has been able to maintain and expand over time, which probably occupies a large geographic space and has a thriving economy able to feed this large population. At the same time, a large population allows a strong social differentiation, which creates new demands for the language and diversifies its use, increasing the number of scopes in which it is used. Number 2, entropy. Entropy can be understood as the geographic dispersion factor of the language and refers to the fact that a language occupies more or less different geographic bases. For example, is official in different countries. Thus, Portuguese and English are spoken on 4 continents. French and Spanish on 3 continents. But Polish and Japanese in only 1 territory on a single continent, without regard to the diasporas, of course. It's assumed that more geographical bases allow the language a greater influence in the world. 3, the vehicular factor. Vehicularity measures the proportion of speakers of the language who do not speak it as a mother tongue, but as a second language. That is, the proportion of speakers who needed to learn it or who wanted to learn it, who eventually invested time and effort in learning that language. The greater the vehicularity of a language, the more value it has in the market of languages. More attractive it is to speakers of other languages. It attracted to itself a greater number of speakers. Vehicularity opposes gregariousness. A gregarious language is spoken almost exclusively by its native speakers. 4, the status of the language, official language. There are between 195 and 230 official languages in the world. It depends on how we count them. Although their number grows slowly. Having an official character gives the language legal legitimation in a given territory and authorizes and allows state and private investments in its equipment and in the production of content. The new demands that arise with the officialization increase interest in their learning and collaborate in their circulation. Thus, French is official in 32 countries, Portuguese in 10 countries, Guarani in South America has a different official character in 4 countries, Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina, and Brazil in this order of importance. 5, the number of translations from the language. This factor demonstrates the ability of a language community to generate interesting content that is demanded to be translated into other languages. It reveals a language associated with a creative, productive, and innovative community. 6, the number of translations into the language. Here we have the opposite pole, a language associated with a community that is able to offer to its speakers important content of other languages and manages to retain them in their language, therefore. This is the case of Hungarian, for example, who developed a large and continuous activity of translations from other languages and today concentrates an impressive patrimony of knowledge. 7, international literary awards. This factor impacts the prestige that a language can have in the language market. Among written languages, and not only in the West, the literature has traditionally been considered one of the most noble and sophisticated activities of the use of languages, reserved for few languages. For this field of thought, literary activity enhances language. Literary production, too, was responsible for setting the standards for many languages. 8, activity in Wikipedia. Because Wikipedia is an open encyclopedia, its activity lends itself to mapping a collective activity much more than an individual one. Writing an encyclopedia entries is a sophisticated literacy activity, and a large number of entries presuppose a strongly literate linguistic community which has generally passed through university banks. As this encyclopedia is virtual, it also reveals an important presence of a particular linguistic community on the internet, in dialogue with other linguistic communities, since an important part of the contents of Wikipedia is translated from one language to another. In the group of more than 150 languages now present on Wikipedia, one of the most multilingual instruments in the world. 9, education at the university level. A preliminary count shows that no more than 80 languages are used in the university systems of the world. A language used for higher education, research and scientific publications, activities that are normally associated with the university reveals a high degree of intellectualization in the definition of the South African linguist Neville Alexander. This means a high degree of formal differentiation through specific terminologies for each area of science, in addition to content. It also reveals the presence and use of a stabilized and cultivated linguistic standard in a highly literate community. 10, the Human Development Index. The HDI reveals the extent to which the language is spoken by an affluent community, living in food security, managing a sustainable economy with a good income distribution, healthcare, and education. Or, on the contrary, a population that invests much of its time Therefore, in the basic activities of survival, time that can be lacking for a longer formal education and more differentiated cultural production and consumptions activities. 11. Fertility index. Populations of countries and language communities increase and decrease over time. The fertility index allows us to forecast the demographic future of the community and see if it will be more or less dense numerically in the future. Thus, while there are languages with a rapid population increase, such as Arabic, there are others stagnating or declining, such as Japanese. And 12, internet network penetration. The digital lives of languages are increasingly becoming a relevant geopolitical factor. The connectivity of the speaker expresses varied indexes, ranging from the availability of electric power and purchasing power to buy computers and cell phones, to the level of literacy, the ability to inform, to generate content, to participate in some way of the globalized economy. These factors in the Calvi barometer of languages allow us to speak of a geopolitics of languages, which points to the differentiation of power among linguistic communities and allows better understanding of the inequality between languages, including the threat of loss or extinction of many of them. Calvi, as we saw, developed a system of observation of the presence of the great languages in the world multilingualism. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, on the other hand, concerned with criteria of justice and development, started from a different point of view. It developed an atlas to map out the phenomenon of languages at risk, that is to say, the diametrically opposed group, that group of languages of particularly fragile linguistic communities, which may not be able to transmit the language for future generations. The phenomenon of linguistic loss, but also the phenomenon of the appearance of new languages, are constitutive factors of world multilingualism, its evolution, and its historical development. Linguistic loss, that is to say, the extinction of languages, reaches an alarming figure and can accelerate until the end of the 21st century, taking many of the 2,600 languages present today in the UNESCO Atlas of Endangered Languages to no longer be spoken in 2100. The disappearance of languages has a profound impact on the life of the linguistic community that speaks it, and is a sign of loss of living conditions, loss of identity and conditions to determine their own future, loss of knowledge and values that underpinned that sometimes for centuries. The loss of languages, moreover, has a negative impact on the whole of humanity, given the creativity of solutions that different cultures using different languages have produced to ensure the permanence and sustainability of the human species on Earth. Thus, the UNESCO Atlas of Languages in Danger is a technical tool for observing multilingualism from the perspective of less spoken languages. And it is of great importance to provide strategies and solutions for this loss to be contained and reversed, one of the most difficult, sophisticated, and urgent tasks for the language policies. The Atlas is part of a series of United Nations policies for the most endangered languages, such as establishing 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Languages is spoken by 370 million indigenous people in 19 countries, more than a quarter of them in India, a country that has a population of more than 106 million indigenous people. Indigenous languages are among the most endangered languages, as shown by the example of Brazil, which has all its 180 languages included in one of the 3 categories of the UNESCO Atlas. The Atlas established 5 categories of endangerment: vulnerable, definitively endangerment, severely endangerment, critically endangerment, extinct. There are a few examples of languages that have been revitalized after a supposed extinction, but that are historically specific practices, difficult to generalize. The information the Atlas provides through these categorizations, with data collected from all 195 member states of UNESCO, is so important that we will return to it in an upcoming discussion reflecting on language policies. It's important to say, however, that UNESCO is transforming the Atlas of Languages in Danger into the UNESCO Atlas of World Languages, a much more complete instrument that will include all the languages. This will also allow us to theoretically contrast different perspectives that have attempted to map multilingualism in recent decades. Demographic censuses are another good way of mapping the multilingualism in a given territory. In this case, we may think that we will not directly observe the inequalities between languages, but only their geographical distribution. Obviously, however, if we can cross reference data of the language presence in the territory with data of the income of the speakers, their level of education, the professions that they have, the neighborhoods in which they live, again, we will have a good picture that the linguistic communities do not occupy the same space, the same place in space, but different steps of an hierarchy. The central census body of the world recommends 1 or 2 of 4 approaches to constructing historical series with the linguistic information of a country. A. Mother tongue, defined as the language usually spoken in the individual's home in his or her early childhood. B. Main language, defined as the language that the person commands best. C. Usual language, defined as the language currently spoken or most often spoken by the individual in his or her present home. And D. Ability to speak 1 or more designated languages, including the country's official language or languages. It's important that the country opts for 1 or 2 lines for the construction of historical series of observation of its multilingualism. Different countries will have their own motivations to choose one or another line. Switzerland, for example, can base its census on the interest in observing the imbalance and stability of its multilingualism of the 3 official languages, German, French, and Italian, and the national language, Romansh. This multilingualism is constitutive of the identity and governance of the country, and the census data can lead to decisions to maintain or to change the language policies in progress. In a country like the United States, on the other hand, there may be a motivation to map the presence and the geographic concentration of speakers of immigration languages, as well as the degree of proficiency with which they speak English, as we can see on the map that shows the distribution of the more than 40 million Spanish speakers in the country, for example. Many countries, however, do not include questions on languages in their censuses. In this case, the motivation may be to maintain the belief that the country is monolingual and that all are speakers of a single language, a case that does not exist in practically any country in the world. Or the predominance of one of the strongest ideologies of national states, that plurality of languages and cultures could be a problem for national unity and governance, not a resource for the development. This is the case of Brazil, again, which only included a question about languages spoken at home during the Vargas dictatorship, 1940, and then triggered a strong linguistic repression and recuperated the question in 1950 census to see if the repression had worked. These few examples, of course, alert us to the complexity of an assessment of multilingualism in different countries and by different experts, ranging from a very positive view to a view focused on problems arising from multilingualism. As, Gunnarsson, the very positive image of multilingualism presented in Grand, Sfredo, and Vaillancourt, 2010, which used Switzerland as an example of a country where multilingualism is counted as an economic asset, is counterbalanced by Fala, 2010, pessimistic account of multilingualism in South Africa, where, according to the author, people are still grappling with issues such as the financial costs of using more than one official language in commerce and industry. Future research on multilingualism in the workplace needs to continue to explore how the gap between vision and practice can be overcome, thus increasing our understanding of how linguistic and cultural issues affect workplace discourse and how problems can be solved. These complex relations between languages and linguistic communities in the power relations permeated by the existence of ethnicities, religions, companies, schools, universities, academies, and states bring us the dimension that languages are menschliches, allzumenschliches phenomena, as Nietzsche said, that is, human, all too human, and that languages exist under permanent intervention and regulation, internal and external to the community of speakers, under the mantle of what we call language policies. Language policy developed as a discipline in the second half of the 20th century and in the beginning of the 21st century, and the concepts of the discipline will focus our attention next. Thank you very much.